to Charlamagne, iHeartRadio, the Mental Wealth Alliance, Dr. Alfie, and how good was Sarah Jake Roberts and her husband? I was sitting right there in the second row taking notes, so that was awesome, but I'm really also excited about this next panel. So everybody come on in, get your seats, get your notepads out, because we're gonna talk about something serious, and it's healing trauma in a time of racial injustice, right? So we're gonna have some experts come up, and I'm truly excited to have these young ladies, and women rather, come up and share their knowledge and expertise. So without further ado, we're gonna go ahead and get started. First up, I'd like to introduce Corey Minor-Smith. She is an attorney, author of #Driven, and founder of Corey Empowers in the Driven You community. Welcome, Corey. Y'all can do better than that. Give it up for Corey.
Thank you.
All right. Mental wealth, let's go. Okay, next up we have Nedra Tawaab. She is a New York Times bestselling author, licensed therapist, and sought-after relationship expert. Give it up for Nedra. And that outfit, okay? Last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Rita Walker. She is a clinical psychologist, award-winning professor, and a leading scholar. Give it up for Dr. Walker. All right, so I'd first like to say that if any of the information that we're discussing today is triggering, please give yourself the grace and space to step away, right? And to heal and then come back in the room when you're ready. So I'm gonna start by reading a blurb. It's been said that historical trauma is an example of intergenerational trauma. It's caused by events that target a group of people, and we could highlight some events that specifically target the Black community, such as slavery, cultural trauma, Jim Crowism, the dark history of the medical experiments in the medical field with our community, redlining in real estate, the new Jim Crow and mass incarceration, and the privatization of prisons, and so much more. Thus, even family members who have not directly experienced the trauma can feel the effects of the events of trauma generations later. And now we are experiencing racism in the workplace, with police brutality, the criminal justice system, voter suppression, and more. So the question for our panel today is, how do we truly begin to heal from the historical trauma that the Black community has endured while we are still in the thick of it, living while being Black? My first question is to Dr. Walker. Can you talk to us about this theory of post-traumatic slave disorder and explain what epigenetics is as it relates to our ancestors' trauma? And then discuss how do we begin the healing process, and how do we talk to our kids and families and really get them to understand the historical trauma and present-day challenges that we face now?
Shanti, I think you gave me a dissertation question to start.
I know that was a lot. I'm sorry.
I think first and foremost, it's good for us to think about trauma as a really very strong reaction to incredibly and enormously stressful things that have happened to us. And that gets passed on from generation, or the reaction to that is passed on from generation to generation. Have you all ever heard anyone say, you act just like your grandmama?
Yes.
You act just like your uncle, and you don't even really know your uncle that well. And that's the part that Greek philosophers back in the day, thinking of this notion of tabula rasa, they thought that we just showed up as humans, like no historical memory, no understanding of what our personalities were. But what they started to understand eventually is that our personality and who we are gets passed on through genetic code. Part of the genetic code does get infused in it the trauma, the way that people dealt with trauma generations ago. And so even if you didn't know those family members, part of who they are is in us. And what we have to do is first and foremost to have these kinds of conversations, to have these, these really important discussions so that we can recognize the impact of trauma for not just that generation, but for the next generation, and that we're honest about it. Too often we just say, well, it's just about me and mine and my family. But we have to start to think about the next generations and how do we break what we've often talked about, generational curses. that I'm going to start to heal in my family so that I can pass on constructive ways of talking to one another, constructive ways of supporting each other and giving grace, recognizing that maybe that person is acting out the way that they do, not just because it's just who they are, but because of something that got passed on to them. So we have to start to give each other a little bit more grace and a lot more compassion and patience.
Absolutely. Would anyone else like to add to that?
We need to talk more. There's a lot of covering up in our community. There's not enough conversation about how people actually feel. There's a lot of masking. We do that with addiction. We do that with connecting to the wrong people, to the wrong things, because we're afraid to really know what's happening. We're afraid to ask people and really pay attention to, how do you feel? This was a really big thing that happened. I remember going to a funeral, and my 12-year-old my 12-year-old cousin was crying because it was his grandmother's funeral, and his uncle walked by and said, "Stop crying, be strong." And I thought, dang, this is a funeral.
Right.
This is where you cry, right? But there is this masking that we do, that even at a funeral, you cannot show that level of emotion. Now, he had a cousin that was a therapist. So I sat there and I said, boy, you cry. This is your grandma's funeral. This is appropriate. So we have to invite people to experience feelings. We have to let them know that it's okay. When things happen, we have to ask them, how do you feel about this? Whether it's a news story, whether it is a death in the family, we cannot continue to pretend that feelings don't exist. We feel all day. So all we have to do is acknowledge that and talk about it. And I say all like it's easy. It's not easy. It's not easy, but it is absolutely possible to get people to start speaking more when we pay attention and we're open to listening.
I love that. Thank you. I also, Sarah talked a lot about talking to yourself, right, and being able to break some of those generational curses. And my father died by suicide when I was just 7 months old, and I would see my mom just crying on end, trying to raise 3 young children, never went to counseling, never went to therapy. And it was my sister, who, God rest the dead, passed away 3 years ago, but broke that curse in our family and finally went to therapy and said, it's okay to express your feelings. It's okay to talk about it. So y'all, it's okay to talk about it. It's okay to tell grandmama, like, you know what, you don't have to cry. We can get help together. It's okay to tell your nieces and your nephews, because a lot of us, you know, we raise the village, if you will. So we have to be able to reach back into our communities, within our own families, and start breaking those cycles. Would you like to add anything, Corey?
I think it's very important that we talk, that we acknowledge our feelings, and that we also know our rights when in terms of our feelings and our ability to take that to court if necessary when we face things at work, for example. We have civil rights laws, we have the voting rights laws for a reason. And unfortunately, with this generational trauma, we are used to fighting not only for ourselves, but collectively, so that we can be free. From the Reconstruction period on, including Jane and Jim Crow, we need to understand that it may be difficult, as was said. It's not easy, but once we acknowledge that there have been issues throughout our history in this country, we are able to overcome it together, collectively, but we first have to acknowledge it in our own lives, in our own households, among our own family members, in order to know the resources that are available for us, to actually use those resources that are available for us, and to enforce our rights, because they are our rights by law.
Yes, thank you. So we got to talk about it, right? That's one of the big takeaways. Silence or Shame, I'm the founder and CEO of Silence or Shame, and we started what's called Silence or Shame Sunday dinners, because y'all remember how Sunday dinner was very important to the Black family? So we're starting that back up. We want y'all to put your phones down and let's talk about it. Let's have those hard conversations at the dinner table so we can begin to address these issues and to break some of these generational curses. My next question is for you, Corey. In a recent survey from the Pew Research Center, Black Americans saw racism in our laws as a big problem and discrimination as a roadblock to progress. A large percentage of the sample group saw racism, police brutality, economic equality, affordable health care, limits to voting, whew, it's a lot, y'all, and the quality of our schools as huge issues in our community. So in your opinion, how can we even think about healing when we have so many cultural and systemic issues of racism still ongoing in present-day society?
Yes, it is so important to understand that the more things change, the more things stay the same. And I say that again in terms of our laws. We have laws that have been put in place to help us to have our constitutional rights because they were not always available to us, especially Black women who were the last to have the right to vote by law. What's important for us to acknowledge is that even though these laws are on the books, they're not always enforced. And it takes us to make sure that they are enforced for all of our communities, the marginalized, the disenfranchised, those who are discriminated against on a daily basis. The people who are often left out of this conversation are people who have disabilities that are related to their mental health conditions, mental disorders, severe mental illness, which is legally defined to be a disability. So when you are Black and have a disability, such as a mental health disorder, you have rights, not only as a citizen, but to have things to be accessible for you or your family member. So as we continue to learn about things, just in regards to something simple as self-care, although that can also not be so simple, but something that we can do individually to be proactive, there are things that we have to do beyond just the individual and more so for the collective in terms of making sure that our rights are provided for us and advocating for individuals as well as others in our community. So I encourage people to understand whatever may be in place for your particular issue, and that you know what rights and what resources are available to you, and that you actually use those resources without shame and without guilt, and know that you can do it by yourself, but you don't have to do it by yourself. There are things that are available, organizations, events like this, that help us to know where we can go for help, not only for ourselves, but also for our loved ones.
Ooh, give it up for that, yes. And I want to take that a step further, because we're talking about cultural and systemic issues, right? And how it affects our community. And we're at the Mental Wealth Expo. How do we get to that mental wealth place to even be able to pour back into ourselves when, how many of you in the room have insurance through your employer? How many have issues trying to find a therapist if need be, or just don't have access, right? Okay, so there are still, right, just like there are food deserts, I think there are deserts in our community to wellness and access to care. So what would you say to that, Dr. Walker, in terms of being able to really find the right therapist, us not being able to necessarily have therapists that come from a place of cultural competency? I mean, to me, there's a lot of racism that still exists in our healthcare system.
There is, and I heard someone say, and they judge you, and you want to find someone who looks like you, who can relate, so that when you show up in therapy, you're not having to explain or re-explain what it's like to show up in your own skin. Like, that goes so very far that when you're already hurting, you don't want to have to go and explain to someone what it means to be Black or African American or Haitian in the US. Like, no one needs to carry that burden. We have to be able to understand also that while someone looks like us, they may not still relate to our experience. So we do have to recognize that as well, that we're all educated in the same system. And what I mean by that is that the system is very racialized, and the system in a lot of ways still says that people who look like us aren't worth anything. But when we go for care, we need to understand what is my specific need? What am I showing up to therapy for? Am I showing up to therapy because I heard someone talking about thoughts and I need to be able to fix my thoughts? Am I showing up to therapy because I'm having relationship challenges and I want to be able to talk to an expert? You know, what is my specific issue? And when you talk to those individuals, because you can screen people, not every therapist is going to be a good match, regardless of their race or ethnicity. You could find a therapist who doesn't look like you, by the way. And I do talk about this in the Unapologetic Guide to Black Mental Health. There's a whole chapter that talks about finding a mental health professional. But when you look for that individual, you ask them, what proportion of folks are you seeing that look like me?
Okay.
How many clients or patients have you had who are Black or African American? And you all know if somebody hedge in their response, then you can probably move on to the next person. But if they respond in a way that's comfortable, that could be a good match for you. But go ahead and just line up about 3 or 4 people so that you can go through the list and figure out which one seems like they could be the best option.
I love that, and I want to get your thoughts on that as well. How many of y'all know that back during the days of slavery, you ever heard of a term, drapetomania? Show of hands. So drapetomania was the term given to, it was a disease almost, right? They told us that if we wanted to seek freedom, that we had a mental illness. So therapy wasn't for the Black community and for our ancestors in the first place. That is why it is so important that we feel confident in being able to ask those questions like Dr. Walker said. That doctor is there, or that therapist, to do us a service. So we have to be unapologetic when we go and seek help and find the right person that works for us. It's kind of like dating. You might have to keep swiping a couple times until you find the right one. Ask those questions, right? Just like you're gonna, when you see that guy or that girl or somebody you want to date, you're gonna drill them, drill your doctors, right? And don't feel a way about it, because we do have to advocate for ourselves. Nedra, would you like to add anything to that?
You just said everything I was gonna say.
Sorry.
No, I'm joking. But I always tell my clients, I work for you, right? So sometimes they apologize to me for being late. I'm like, I'm on your time, right? I am here for you. And sometimes just because I'm Black, it doesn't mean that I'm going to be the right fit for you. If you have a certain issue, that's the type of therapist you need to find. I don't treat everything. I treat particular things. So even though we are the same race, we may not have the same idea of what this process should be. So it's really important that we're not just finding a therapist that's Black or a therapist that's Filipino. We need to find the person that is a good fit for us. And sometimes that might look like not excluding a white therapist, because that person may be able to treat the issues that you uniquely have. So as you're searching for a therapist, look at everything. Don't just look at their picture and say, oh my gosh, this person can't help me. It depends on a lot of factors. So we can't say that, because of this one thing, this person can't help me. It is a lot like dating. So you may have to talk to a few therapists, and you can fire your therapist. If you go a few times and you feel like it's not a good fit for you, find another therapist. So it's not like you have to stay in it because you started. You can find someone else. The other thing that's really important, discuss the way that you want to be treated by the therapist. So often we go into it with an expectation of, I want a therapist that's directive. I want a therapist that understands this. But we're not communicating that. And so we get this therapist that just sits there and nod, and we're like, why is the therapist like this? Well, this is the type of therapist that doesn't give a lot of feedback. So we have to know what we like. I happen to like a therapist that nods, right? I'm a therapist. I just want you to listen. But I wouldn't recommend my therapist to my friends because they like someone who gives feedback. So we have to treat it as a whole process and figure out, this is the type of relationship I would like, and this is the person who can meet that need.
Yes, I love that. Great information.
I just want to touch on that as well.
Yes.
Because you had mentioned about like a food desert, healthcare desert.
Yeah.
We have to elevate that to apartheid. This was intentional, institutionalized by law. And just because laws change doesn't mean that those actions just go away. They are ingrained in the system, and that's why we say systematic, right? Systemic. Because it is there. It is a part, and it has been a part of the policies and procedures. So even in the healthcare industry, there is lack in our communities, intentional lack. It's apartheid, not just a desert. And when we go out and find people who can help us, we want them to be culturally competent. So it's just touching on that, not just because they're Black, but culturally competent, not just because they're white that they can't. Cultural competence is what we're also looking for when we strive to get help that can help our families and to help ourselves. So please just understand that these things didn't just happen. They were by law to happen. And we have to make sure that the changes are in place and that we make the change be present in our communities.
100%.
Can I just say one thing?
Yeah, sure.
Instead of cultural competence, maybe cultural openness.
Okay.
Because competence, I remember being taught competence. I have a book, and by each ethnicity it goes through, it's like, this is how you treat a Polish family, this is how you treat a Jamaican family. And really, is it? Or is it me being open to the person coming into this space? Because just because the person is Black, it doesn't mean that they come from a certain neighborhood. It doesn't mean they have a certain type of socioeconomic background, or they had one parent or two. We have to be culturally open to the person in the room.
Yes, thank you, thank you. And y'all know that Corey talked about it being systemic, and it's election season coming up. So I'm not telling you who to vote for, but I'm telling you to vote. Because we're talking about structural racism within healthcare, and these states have pulled back so much funding, right, around mental health care, and especially for vulnerable populations and underserved communities. So make sure that you find out what's going on in your boroughs, right, in the state, and get out there and vote so that we can make sure that we get the funding that we need to be able to help from a mental health perspective. So I want to go back to you, Nedra. As a relationship therapist, how do you think racism has shaped some of our Black adults who experience childhood neglect and discrimination, and how do we break the cycles of unhealthy relationships in our communities that may be attributed to generational trauma?
The best possible outcome is for people to heal before they have children, right? Or to start the healing process. That typically doesn't happen. And when it doesn't happen, we take all of that stuff that we did not like, we try to improve a little bit. So we try to provide what we needed in childhood. So let's say you didn't have a parent who said, I love you. So you can be really mean to your kids and say all the time, I love you, right? You know I love you, but you're being really mean. So you feel, oh my gosh, I'm a great parent, I've improved. And then that child, they do these other things because we get into this habit of, I'm not going to be like my mom, but I will do the things that I needed, but it might not be what your child needs. Mm-hmm. And so we need to reconsider what parenting looks like.
Say that again. I'm sorry.
We need to reconsider what parenting looks like. Often we think it is this control situation where really it is this openness to discovering who this child is and what they need. Mm-hmm. So many of our parents did not do this. They come with this program of, this is how I will parent you. I may not need this. Maybe my sibling needs this, but I may need a different thing. You don't have to punish and beat and, all of these things. What is the effectiveness? What is the proof? We don't even think about how it felt to happen to us. That's how disconnected we are from the things that we continue to apply. If we thought more about what it felt like to be nervous your first day of school, what it felt like to not know what was going on, but you see something changing in your environment, what it felt like to be yelled at an adult when you didn't really do anything wrong. We could parent better.
Be bullied, right?
Or to be bullied.
Bullied doing the things of Jim Crow.
Because what we do so often is from our adult perspective, we shut down children. It's like, that's not a big deal. Well, yeah, it's not a big deal to you at 35, but at 12, that was a really big deal. So we have to learn how to parent in better ways. We don't do that because it's really hard. It's not a community of people around you supporting these new philosophies of parenting. There's a lot of pushback when you don't want to spank your kids. There's a lot of pushback when you don't want to have them around certain family members. So it does take a level of courageousness to do it in a different way, but it also changes generations because kids have to be able to have a different experience from you. And it's so important relationship-wise that you start building the relationship at birth. If you're a mother, when they're in your stomach, you start building that relationship right away. As a parent, one of my goals is I don't want to have to do a lot of repair work. I want to treat you well now.
Right.
I want a relationship with you today. So when you're 35, hopefully you go into therapy, but I hope you're not talking about me, you know? I want you to go, but I want you to be talking about something else.
That's right.
So right now, I'm open. My kids say stuff to me and I don't like it. It hurts. I'm like, what do you mean you don't like that? I can't dress you? You know, and I deal with it as it comes, but I recognize you are a person. You get to have your own experience, and this is an opportunity for me to deal with my stuff.
Oh, y'all give it up for that. That was, you said a word. So I think the overarching theme, right, in that was about modeling behavior, right? How do you model behavior, right, early on for your kids so that they won't end up having so many issues, right, and you actually treat them how they want to be treated? That was beautiful. Thank you. I want to go next to Dr. Walker. It is essential to understand how deeply ingrained racial trauma is, but it's also important for people to believe that growth and healing are possible, right? That's why we're here today. How can we find better ways to partner with other races and ethnic groups that truly want to be allies for us and want to be on the right side of history? Because there's been a lot of talk about allyship and all that, right, after the pandemic and after George Floyd. So how do we deal with that?
Well, one thing I will always say to allies is that we don't need an elaborate system in place on day one. Tomorrow, anyone can go into the workplace, the grocery store, the bank, wherever they are, and if they see a person of color, if they see a black person being mistreated, say something. Use your privilege in the way that marginalized people do not and cannot. Because at the end of the day, there is a power structure in place that many of us don't have access to. And so when we can get the individuals who are in fact privileged to be able to speak up, make change, if they know that there is some policy, some rule, some law, or something that disproportionately affects black people, then do something. But again, at the grocery store, I appreciate if those videos, maybe you all have seen them in social media, where some black person is pulled over on the side of the road and there's a white person saying, "I can't believe you," and they're yelling and they're going off. I'm like, good. Use your privilege because you can survive this encounter in a way that a black person won't. And so we need those individuals to step up and not be afraid to step up, because if they don't, there are a lot of folks who are going to be harmed, and there are a lot of folks who may not make it home.
If you see it, say it. I'm just saying, allies, if you see it, say it, okay? Anybody want to add anything to that? All right, I'm going to go to the last question, and then I want to ask all of you about what the future of breaking the generational trauma looks like. So Corey, can you talk about your experience being a caregiver of someone with a mental illness, and if you experienced any secondary trauma from that experience? And then lastly, did you find any discrimination and disparities for access to care for your loved one, and how did you combat that?
Yes, the short answer to both yes and yes. It has been a significant journey being there for my mother, you know, since the age of 14, so it's been well over 30 years. But more importantly...
Can you tell them what your mother was diagnosed with, if you don't mind?
Sure. My mother was diagnosed with manic depression, paranoid schizophrenia, now known as bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. And in this very moment, I am struggling to assist and help my mother to maintain her dignity, her respect, her rights, by those who are in the positions to provide the treatment, to provide the services that our people in our community need. Not just the mental health, but also housing. Many times people's behaviors that are associated with severe mental illness can lead to eviction. And as you all know from all over the news resources at this point, housing is at a shortage. And so in order to assist my mother, I have had to learn to deal with my own trauma related to the issues that I have to face. And not only adulting for myself, but adulting for a whole nother person, and making sure that I continue to advocate for her through the illness, that I love her through the illness, because unfortunately, her behaviors lead to her being verbally aggressive to me, being verbally assaultive to me and other people. And I still fight on her behalf to make sure that her rights are acknowledged, not only as a Black woman, living as a Black woman, but a Black woman who is living with a disability, and that she has rights, that that people who are serving her understand that she needs assistance, but it doesn't mean that she's an invalid and can't do anything on her own, but advocating for her, helping her to navigate the system, at the same time understanding the importance of self-care for myself. And as I continue to learn about the laws, researching things, I want to share that information with other people so that our community knows that severe mental illness is real. People are not just playing or on drugs or drinking. It is real, and that there are resources that are available to people in our community, and many times it is free. So again, I encourage people to do it unashamedly, unapologetically, use the resources, and make sure if it's you or your loved one has their rights acknowledged and that the services are provided to them as they are due.
Yes, thank you. Yes, please clap for that. I don't know how many of you have experienced a family member or a loved one with a severe mental illness, and we talk a lot about self-care and wellness and mental wealth, but there are so many people in our community suffering with a severe mental illness, and until you have experienced that as a caregiver, it's really tough. And the racism, right, that we experience with the facilities, the treatment facilities, you really have to advocate for your loved ones in those situations because the system just is not set up, especially for people of color with a severe mental illness. So again, keep advocating for your loved ones. And I also want to make note that if you do know anyone in crisis, we do have a new number, 988. So please take that down. In addition to the Suicide Prevention Lifeline number, which is 1-800-273-TALK, you can now dial 988 and be connected to a crisis counselor. So we have about 3 minutes left. In a minute or less, can each panelist tell me what does the future of healing from ongoing generational trauma look like? And what are some best practices of wellness and self-care as a community that we can implement? And we'll start with you, Dr. Walker.
Well, I think that if we can, first and foremost, resist distractions. So distractions show up with the amount of media that we consume, social media that we consume, the social comparisons that come about from spending too much time on the internet, and I am guilty of it too. But if we can first just start to be aware of the distractions, the Twitter beefs, they seem like fun, but they are distractions from real issues. And if we can instead start to do something that we don't like to do, and that is get in each other's business. I understand that we don't want to go and find out what's going on with so-and-so and this person and that person. It's in part because we have gotten into a place of a lot of judgment that when we ask people how they're doing, then we want to say, well, it's not that bad, or when I went through it, it wasn't so awful. But we have to get to a place where we use our ABCs. We can assume that we can be helpful, be present, put the phone down, and cancel the judgments so that we can start to understand better how folks are doing so that we can actually be helpful and build community. If folks sat down and didn't say hello, or at least look hello at the person sitting next to you, then, just look to your side and say, hey, I see you. We are here together. We're in this together as we build community. Thank you all.
Absolutely. Nedra.
There are enough people in this room, if everyone decided to do one thing, generations would be changed. We often think that the family structure has to change, everybody else got to change, and it's us. If we just started to do the little bit that we can and not match everybody else's energy, if everybody else is yelling at the dinner table, be the peace. You sit there and you practice something else. You decide to change what happens in that environment. So often we are consumed with, if this changed, if this person changed, I can't believe this. If you could change yourself, if you could learn to respond differently to the people who won't change, that will change generations. So yes, be in community with other people, but also be present with yourself. And a lot of that is going to be independent change. I cannot change them. This is how I can manage my reaction. I can only change me. We have enough trauma ourselves, and we're trying to help people with their trauma. Yeah. How do I work through my trauma so I can be of service to another person? So it starts with you. The generational trauma can change just with you doing one thing.
Amen. Thank you. Give it up. Last but not least, Corey.
Yes, thank you very much. In my book, #Driven, I talk about 5 principles, one being faith, the second one being motivation, the third being determination, the fourth being preparation, and the fifth, action. I want to focus on the fifth, action, and thank Charlamagne for having this event and all that he does to take action to help us to know about mental health and wealth. We can wish upon a star, we can daydream, we can think about it, but we have to take action, as it was said, in our own lives and in our communities. If we sit idly by, change is not going to happen. Taking action helps us to understand that we can learn all that we can about our own mental health and wealth and in our community, and learn about the things that you can do to make whatever necessary changes are applicable in your life. I moved at least 21 times before I even went to college, lived in 8 households, 14 different schools. I wanted better for my children, but me just wanting better for my children was not going to affect change. I had to take action. So I'm encouraging you all, as you sit here and record and laugh and cry, take action. Go back out in your communities. Find the organizations that can help the people in your family, you individually. Share the information. Don't just hold it to yourself. We are all gifts from God for this earth. Don't keep the gift to yourself. Share it. Help our communities to be better. Create a different type of life for you and for those who are coming behind you. Thank you.
Yes. All right, our time has come to an end. The last thing I want to say is take some time to open up a book or get on Google, right? Just like y'all be scrolling, look at all them TikTok videos, and I ain't judging, because I be on TikTok too. But I did a lot of research today about generational trauma. So I need y'all to do something for me. Look to your left and say, neighbor. A little bit louder. Neighbor. Today, the cycle ends. We will dismantle generational trauma in the Black community. Y'all give it up for our panelists.